Hello, and now we're going to talk about Hume's distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. This is the first slide presentation from section 4. And let's move on to this chart that we have here. So this chart shows the difference. Over here we have relations of ideas, matters of fact. And what I'm going to do in the slide presentation is discuss these differences. So here's the chart, and you can come back to the chart for a later reference. Let's move on to, let's go down to this idea here. So right here we have an example, 3 times 5 equals 15. And that's a statement that states a relation of ideas, the relationship between 3 and 5 and 15. And over here we have an example of a matter of fact statement, the sun will rise tomorrow. And that's just something about matters of fact, the sun and its movement and the earth spinning and all of those things. And if we come down here, we see that relations of ideas are really about abstract objects, whereas matters of fact are about real objects. Now let's go look at that slide next, real and abstract objects. So what is a real object? Well, a chair, an animal, you, me, the sun, real objects, physical things in the world, real objects. And when we make statements about them, we're making statements about matters of fact, about the way things are in the world, so to speak. Well, what are abstract objects then? Well, for Hume, abstract objects can be things like numbers and shapes, and abstract ideas like the idea of democracy or something like that. And these are all abstract objects. So we don't really think of numbers as or shapes as physical things, right? The number 2 is not a physical thing. It's an abstract object, if you will. We can say things about the number 2. We can say true things about the number 2. We can make statements about the relationship between 2 and 4, and so on. And these are all statements about abstract objects. So that's one difference between the relations of ideas and the matters of fact. Relations of ideas are about abstract objects. Matters of fact are about real objects. Let's move on to another difference. Hume thinks there's a difference between how we argue about these things. We can use deductive arguments when stating matters of fact. We can use deductive arguments when dealing with relations of ideas and abstract objects. Let me give you an example here. And the key term here that we want to understand is what it means for a deductive argument to be valid. And what that means is that it's a valid argument if, when the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. And let's look at this example down here. Premise 1, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is human. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. So if it's true that all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates must be mortal. That's a deduction. That's a valid deduction. Now, not all deductions are valid. Some are invalid, where the premises don't lead to the conclusion. But in this one, we can see if those premises are true, that conclusion has to be true. Well, what then is an inductive argument? Inductive arguments are different than valid arguments. They're not valid or intended to be valid. They can be strong or weak. If the premises are true, that doesn't mean the conclusion has to be true. The truth of the premises in an inductive argument typically gives us more reason to believe that the conclusion is true, but it could still be false. For instance, here's one right here. Let's imagine that your car started yesterday and it started today, so you might make a prediction that your car will start tomorrow. That's a good argument, especially if you had a lot more evidence about your car starting in the past. Say it started for a whole year in a row. Then you would think tomorrow it's very likely to start. That's a good, strong inductive argument. But just because the premises are true doesn't mean the conclusion is true. It could still be false. So we don't evaluate inductive arguments in the same way as we evaluate deductive arguments. And note that the premises in an inductive argument are from the past. They're from past experience, and the conclusion is a prediction about the future. And that's different than a deduction. And this leads to this idea about certain versus probable conclusions. When you're talking about relations of ideas, you use deductions to prove things, and you can know that your conclusions have to be true. So when doing mathematics, we can make arguments and we can be certain about the conclusions. But when dealing with matters of fact, not relations to ideas, but matters of fact, we have to use inductive arguments. And even with a strong inductive argument, it's possible that the conclusion is false. So we can only make probable conclusions. It's likely that your car will start tomorrow, but it's possible that it doesn't. So we can have a statement that is a relation of ideas. We can arrive at that statement through a deductive argument. We then know that the conclusion of that statement has to be true. We can be certain about it. And then the question is, how did we come up with it? Well, think about 3 and 5. How do you know that 3 and 5 is 15? How do you prove things in mathematics? You don't have to go out and do field work. You don't have to get experiences of the numbers. You can't. You just simply take the ideas you have in your mind, and Hume thinks those ideas come from experiences, but you've got the ideas now in your mind, and then you, through just thinking about it, you can compare these ideas and discover their relationships. So it is pure thought that discovers these relationships between the ideas. But the ideas themselves, Hume argues, come from experiences. He's still an empiricist. What about the conclusions of an inductive argument? What about matters of fact statements? Those ultimately come from experience, and you can't get at them through pure thought. You can't conclude definitively just by thinking about it that the sun will rise tomorrow. You can simply make a prediction based on past experience. And if you want to find out if your statement is true, the sun will rise tomorrow, you're going to have to wait until tomorrow and experience it. And so if you want to discover the truth about reality, this is really an important point here about the matters of fact, about the world. If you want to discover the truth about these physical objects in the world, it requires experience. And that makes Hume firmly an empiricist. You cannot discover the truth about the world in terms of physics and chemistry and whatnot without experience. And that's really the difference then between the important difference between the relations of ideas and the matters of fact. And if you really want to discover matters of fact, you really want to know what the world is like, you have to get that experience. And that means there's going to be some limitations on what we can know about the world.